Well, good evening. We were saying earlier that the last time I was here doing an event like this with Thomas Piketty, and I suspected that slightly more people had got to the end of Michael Lewis's books than Thomas Piketty's. But as Hannah was saying, Michael has written a lot of books, sold more than 9 million copies. Yet I think there's still quite a lot of journalists and writers who don't resent his success. Maybe just a few left. Economic journalists and financial journalists, I think, have a particular reason to harbour resentment of you because you've trodden all over our territory and actually made it interesting and exciting and entertaining, starting with Liar's Poker, but also slices of the financial crisis with Boomerang and The Big Short. And when I heard that you'd written Flash Boys about high-frequency trading, I actually thought for a minute whether it might be a dare that someone had said, I bet you can't do this. I bet you can't make algorithmic trading interesting. With the sort of exciting action at the beginning involves laying fiber optic cable, but it's still a really good read. It's so annoying. But we're here at least partly to talk about your latest book. Oh, I should say also, of course, you still do all this great journalism as well for Vanity Fair, interviewing Barack Obama and writing for The New Yorker and many others, and Bloomberg, for whom I now work as well. But we are here to talk about the latest book, The Undoing Project, which is about the friendship of two behavioral psychologists, one of whom who went on to win the Nobel Prize. And I guess, the obvious question is, how did you find these two people? You are famous for bringing to life very complex, often sort of shady, difficult to understand areas by finding the right people to follow. How did you alight on these two characters? Tell us a bit about them.
Well, I'll tell you how it came about, because it is the oddest experience I've had writing books. Typically with books for me, I find a subject, decide in a few months that it's a book, spend a year and a half figuring out what the book is, and 6 months writing it, and I'm done. This thing goes back more than a decade when I first started thinking about it. And the way it began, more than a decade ago, I wrote a book called Moneyball, which God knows, probably nobody in this audience knows about, because they didn't know. Well, it didn't find it. It was a book about American baseball, so it didn't travel very well. But it was
lots of football managers actually would disagree. They've all read it, but
well, so really, I have to quickly explain this book because that's the origin of the Undoing Project. The story in Moneyball was about a team that had no money having to compete against teams with lots of money in professional baseball. I mean, I think the structure in British football is probably the same, right? They're poor teams and rich teams. And I had this poor team in my backyard that had a fifth the sums of the rich teams and was running circles around all these rich teams. And it made no sense to me because I thought if the market for the baseball players were efficient, the rich teams would just buy all the good players and the poor teams wouldn't stand a chance. So this story that emerges, it turns out the market for baseball players is not efficient. It turns out that the people who were the baseball experts, the scouts who were evaluating baseball players, misjudged the players. And the team that I wrote about, the Oakland A's, explained to me how this all worked. And I thought, when I was writing that story, someone once said an explanation is where the mind comes to rest. And my mind came to rest like a step short of where it should have when I wrote that book. Because where it came to rest was, isn't it amazing that these people can be so misvalued that this team is able to find kind of undervalued players? And the moment I thought, this is the story, I was in the locker room of the Oakland A's interviewing players about what it felt like to be on this oddly managed team. And for the first time, kind of saw them, it was after a game, and saw them coming out of the showers. It was the first time I saw them naked. And it was such an unpleasant sight. They kind of had cankles and fat rolls, and the baseball uniform covers up all sorts of stuff, and they just didn't look like professional athletes. And I went to the management and said, if you line the bodies of your players against a wall and asked anybody what they did for a living, nobody would guess they were professional athletes. They would guess they were, accountants. And they said that's part of the point. They said that one of the things we look for are players who are physically defective in some way, because by using the statistical analysis to get to their performance value, we know how good they are, but the market is deceived by what they look like. So as a result, they had a player with 2 club feet. They had players, it was a bit of an island of misfit toys situation. And so I thought, wow, forget their athletes. Think of them as corporate employees. They're doing what they do for a living in front of millions of people. There's statistics attached to every move they make while they're on the job. They've been doing the same job for 100 years. If these people can be misvalued, who can't be misvalued? So I thought that was my story. So that book comes out, and it's reviewed by a writing team of Cass Sunstein, who's a legal scholar and worked in the Obama administration, is now teaching at Harvard, and Richard Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics and is kind of one of the founding fathers, maybe the founding father of behavioral economics. And they say, very gently, but nevertheless damningly, Mr. Lewis does not understand the point of his own book. And it's really an interesting story that this team has figured out that if you use statistical judgment instead of intuitive judgment to work out who a good baseball player is, you're gonna do a better job of it. But he never asked, they say about me, truthfully, that why this is happening. Like, why is it that experts in the market for baseball flesh misjudge the assets? And they said, and this question has been answered by these 2 Israeli psychologists, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose work, a series of papers, really just kind of like a dozen papers written in the 70s and early 80s, explored what the human mind is doing when it's making that kind of judgment, when it's making a judgment in conditions of uncertainty, when it's valuing a stock or valuing a baseball player or making a medical diagnosis or voting for a political candidate. What his story is really about are the systematic errors the mind makes that this team, the Oakland Athletics, is exploiting. When I saw that, I went, oh no. Because I knew that the people in that baseball front office were thinking categories. They were thinking about the kinds of mistakes that the market made. They were aware that a good-looking player was going to be overvalued. So when they saw a player was good-looking, they would tend not to pay much attention to him. Because if he was any good at baseball, he would be properly valued. They were also aware that a hideous-looking player or a fat player or a player with 2 club feet, there might be some value there. They were aware that players that looked like players who had played and done well would be overvalued. Players who looked like nobody else would be undervalued. They were aware that players who did things that were very, very vivid, power hitters, people who were fast on the field, things that were stuck in the mind and the memory, would be overvalued. People who had subtle skills that were nevertheless extremely important, like an ability to determine whether a pitch was a ball or a strike. And I promise I won't say any more about baseball. That would be undervalued. So they had these ideas of the systematic mistakes, but they'd never connected it up with these guys' work, although they were familiar with behavioral economics. So that's the beginning. Now, I can continue because I can get you to Danny Kahneman.
You mentioned that duo.
So here I am sitting thinking I screwed up my own book, that I missed a trick. And it bothered me. It bothered me for the better part of 2 or 3 years. I'd think about it, and I went and read their papers. I thought, that's interesting. Not so interesting I'd want to write a book about it. I mean, the academic papers really are written to drive people away from them.
And those ones are more sort of readable than many. But
but it's the tallest midget syndrome. Yes. People would say, oh, the academics would say, oh, they're wonderful writers. And I'd pick it up and I'd go, oh my God, what do the bad writers look like? And
really, really bad.
The reason is that academics are writing for a narrow audience of people who are trying to destroy them. And so they write in this crouch. They're terrified. They're terrified of making a mistake. And so only after they're hugely successful and tenured and no one can do anything bad to them are they brave enough to make a joke. And so anyway, the ideas in the papers were really interesting. For academic papers, they were very well written. But if it had just been that, I'd have said, well, I missed a trick. But I was having drinks with a friend. I have a friend who serves as a kind of literary therapist for me, who happens to be a psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley. We meet kind of once a month and just talk about our problems. And I said to him, it's been bothering me, this thing in your field. These guys named Kahneman and Tversky. Do you know anything about them? And he laughed. He said, I was Amos Tversky's teaching assistant, and Danny Kahneman lives half a mile from your house. And he said, I'll email him now, go see him. So I went up to see Danny Kahneman, just to see what it was I had missed. And I get there, and he had won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. As a psychologist who knew not much economics, which is a pretty good trick, and I thought, I never met a Nobel Prize winner. And I didn't know I didn't know how to, I felt like there must be some ceremony in meeting this guy. So when he opens the door, he's got shorts and bare feet, and his hair is sticking up every which way. He looks absolutely miserable. And I say something like, oh, what an honor to meet you. And he looks at me like I'm crazy. And he says, you mean the Nobel Prize? He says, that's so overrated. He says, don't pay any attention to that. He says, the big problem is you come on a horrible day. He says, I've thrown my book in the garbage can. They've made me write a book. They've talked these people, these evil agents and publishers, talked me into writing a book about my intellectual life. And it's so bad, I realized yesterday or the day before it was going to ruin my reputation, and so I've thrown it away. And I had this conversation with him about his book. And it emerges in the course of this conversation that he has been on basically a several-year quest while he's been writing this book to persuade himself that his book is awful. And he's done things like distribute $5,000, give $5,000 to a friend of his in the field, in his field, psychology, to distribute to young, smart people in the field who will remain anonymous to him, to write hatchet jobs of his own book so he will learn to hate his book. And I thought, God, how bad can this thing be? And I took some of it with me, and it was Thinking Fast and Slow. It was a book that has sold 7 million copies. Now, it's a book that, a bit like the Piketty book, I'm not sure everybody got to the end. However, it's filled with interest. Filled stuff with interest. So the beginning of this relationship was me running back up to his house saying, don't throw that thing away. Really. And he said, rightly, you don't know anything. It's nice of you to say, you don't know anything. But it was the beginning of a relationship. And we go on these long walks in the Berkeley Hills. And the walks invariably turned back to his relationship with Amos Tversky, which was more than an intellectual collaboration. It was a love affair. It was an absolute love affair without the sex, because I think for them, sex was just like second rate compared to thinking. And it was clearly tumultuous love affair. And the ideas that they had grew out of this relationship. And I started to think, maybe there's a story that's a love affair about these people, and the ideas are part of the story, but it's about this relationship. And the more I dug into it, the more I saw that this collaboration, it was about collaboration, that the things they did together were very unlike the things they had done separately. And I got interested in that notion that what people do together can get very interesting if the people are the right people collaborating. So that was the beginning. That was the beginning of, maybe this is a book. And so that's like late 2007. it isn't until 2015, and between 2007 and 2015, I'd made 5 10-day trips to Israel. I'd interviewed every old person who knew them. I'd wandered around Amos. Amos had died in 1996. I'd wandered around Amos's life. I'd gotten access to his papers. Oddly, I'd found out that the one term I'd taught at Cal Berkeley, I had a student named Orrin Tversky, who I was very fond of, who was Amos's oldest son. And he opened the doors to the family, memories. And so I gathered string for 8 years before I decided I actually had a book. For the longest time, I thought, this isn't a book for me. So, what finally drove me to write the thing. I mean, the problems were obvious. I didn't know anything. I mean, I didn't even have a story to tell myself why I should be writing a book about 2 psychologists, because this isn't a book about economics. It's a book about psychology that happens to end up having a big effect on economics. I am a happy goy from New Orleans, Louisiana. My subjects were, at least one of my subjects was a horribly neurotic, unhappy Jew from Israel. And the backdrop to the work was Israel and the birth of the Israeli state. And I thought, I have no business with that subject matter. And then there was this other problem where I've never really felt I had a problem with my subjects being smarter than me. I always felt like I was the B student writing about other B students. Or at least if they were very smart, like Wall Street people, they were in a B student environment. It wasn't really an intellectual environment. There's a laughter. There's a knowing.
They like you laughing at Wall Street.
There's a knowing laughter. But this was the B student writing about the A students, which is really tricky. I knew that no matter how good I got at them, that I would have a hard time getting my mind fully around them. And at some level, I knew that no matter how good a book I wrote, they would, if Amos was alive and Danny would be dismissive of it. So all this served as kind of a break. And what saved me was the characters, getting to know these 2 characters, which I'm happy to talk about the characters now, if you would like.
I mean, the characters are wonderful, and actually Amos Tversky, maybe partly because he's only living through the stories that you're telling about him, he's obviously incredibly funny.
Did you know Amos Tversky?
No, I didn't know him, but I wanted to know him, having read some of these quotes and jokes he had. He had this wonderful, because it is, as you say, it's a very unusual milieu for you, but I think for any of us who would read your books, that it's in the backdrop of war and the beginning of Israel. So you've got someone who's going out being a commando and being in the army at the same time, or being in the Air Force at the same time as having these thoughts and having this academic life, which is something which is so jarring for people. So I think that was something completely different about that character. But he also just has all these great lines, and you'll I'm sure, tell us many of them, but I loved him talking cross with his soldiers on his detail, who didn't wear helmets because they said if they were going to get killed, there's a bullet with their name on it. And he would say, well, what about all the bullets that just say, to whom it may concern? And his organization of his stuff, the letters and things that would just pile up on the desk, where he says the great thing about things that are really urgent is if you wait long enough, they're not urgent anymore, which I just thought.
Yes, and he would tell people he was so one of his very unusual traits was he was immune to social embarrassment. He thought people wasted way too much time avoiding social embarrassment. And if he found himself in any kind of gathering that bored him or didn't think it was worth his time, small dinner party, staff meeting, faculty meeting, board meeting, he'd up and leave. He'd just up and leave. And he'd tell his people who would ask him about it, he'd say, it's funny. When you're sitting there and you realize this isn't worth your time, and please don't take this advice, it's very hard to think of the excuse why you need to be gone. But if you get up and you just start walking, it's amazing how fast your mind comes up with a reason. And he would tell, his graduate students would walk in on him, and he was, by the late 80s, he's known as famous Amos to them, because in the little world he cares about, he's worshipped by people. He's thought to be by everyone I interviewed who knew him, the smartest man they ever met. And he did it without pretension. He did it, he was just smart. He had a kind of logician's mind that caused people to think, well, Richard Nisbett, the psychologist at Michigan, said after he spent time with him, he designed what he said was the shortest intelligence test ever designed, the Tversky Test, he called it. And it was, the longer it takes you after you meet Amos Tversky to figure out you're stupider than he is, the stupider you are. And nobody disagreed with that. And Amos didn't disagree with it either. But it's hard to, I want to tell the audience a bit about him because, the stories, there were many stories like this. In Israel, there is a prize given to a young physicist called the Wolfe Prize. And the Wolfe Prize is a bit like maybe the Bates Prize in the United States in economics. That the person who gets it often goes on to get the Nobel Prize. And Amos was passing through Israel. This is after he had moved to the United States. And they were having a party for the Wolfe Prize winner at Tel Aviv University. And the hostess of the party, who was inviting mainly physicists, wanted Amos to come along. And he comes along. And the next day, she gets a call from the winner of the Wolfe Prize, and who says, "Who was that physicist I was talking to?" And he describes Amos physically. It takes her a while to figure out who he's talking about. And then she finally says, "Oh, no, that's not a physicist. That's Amos Tversky. He's a psychologist." And the Wolfe Prize winner said, "That's not possible. He was the smartest physicist I've spoken to." And how he did this is it's a curious thing. But he had the mind of a logician, and he could just take things you said and with very little knowledge, let you see them in a different way. So all of this to say is that he was a powerful character. One of the problems I had in writing him, I thought I was going to have, is that he was dead. I couldn't speak to him. But he made such an impression on everybody who met him. His file cabinets filled with his papers still sit outside his office. They've been there for 21 years in the halls of Stanford University. Nobody wants to get rid of them. He saved only what he wanted to save. So he speaks from the grave with a very clear signal. He was, his graduate students would describe to me coming into him once a week. He'd answer his mail or look at his mail, and he'd have them in neat piles. He'd have Monday's mail, Tuesday mails, Wednesday mail, and he would be on a desk. And they say it would be, by the late 80s, it was piled up every day because everybody wanted him for something. They wanted to give him an honorary degree or come to their dinner party or ask him to consult them. And he'd look at the letters, and 2 out of 3 he'd just throw in the garbage can. And he told one of his graduate students who was asking him, that's a personal letter to you and you didn't even open it. He'd say, I have a what can they do to me rule. If they can't do anything to me, I just chuck it away. And so this person who was so particular about what he said, how he spent his time, what he kept, emerges as this very clear character, in a way, oddly, that Danny Kahneman does not, who is a very murky, changeable, shape-shifting character. But the power of the personalities and the oddness of the combination, nobody who knew them in Israel could imagine how they could collaborate. Nobody could see, how the relationship worked. The thinking was, Amos had no time for difficult people. I mean, he thought life was pretty simple, and he thought people were basically pretty simple, and the complexity they added to it was mostly bullshit. But every now and then, a complicated person enters his life, and it's because he's complicated in a really interesting way. And Danny was complicated in a really interesting way. Danny brought, Danny brought a kind of artistic imagination to the logician's scalp, and Amos went to work on it. Anyway.
So he needed someone who was going to produce all this intellectual fodder, which he could then think about. But just going back a little bit on the backdrop, which is this unusual one in terms of the early years in Israel, and they'd both had, which we don't necessarily need to go into here, but they'd both had their own kind of harrowing family experiences in war and loss. And you do make the point in the book, and I think even it's Danny Kahneman makes the point, that perhaps it's because they had that experience and they're surrounded by war in Israel and the threat of war, that they look at some of these things differently, when actually economists are often have done these elaborate, that when they experiment or they think about choosing between things, it's usually between two gains. You know, you're going to make money this way, you're going to make money that way, and that's often how finance is thought about. But if you're thinking in terms of losses, one of the insights of behavioral economics is that you think very differently about avoiding a loss or suffering a loss. So do you think that did, you know, the backdrop in Israel did affect the way they approached some of these problems, gave them a bit more of an insight?
Absolutely. I think so one time, Danny said to me, interestingly once, that when they were in a room alone together, just talking, what they were doing, even though they basically invent the field of behavioral economics, and even though they invent a field inside psychology called judgment and decision making, and even though their work kind of systematically touches lots of parts of life, they're just thinking, what makes people tick? They're just having fun talking about things they've seen. And he said they were talking, usually what they were talking about is war or Israeli politics. Things they'd seen in the army, or things they were observing in the Israeli political life. And they'd made some conscious decision, and why I never quite understood, not to include any of those examples in their work. The start of the conversation is what they're seeing in Israel. But it's even more than that. I mean, I think that when you look at who they are as people, I mean, Danny Kahneman, this is a man who spent age 7 to 11 as a Jew in France, hiding from Nazis, because his father had misjudged the Germans' intentions. His father, who had lived through World War I, said, "I've seen this all before, and the Germans are no threat to the Jews. We'll stay. We won't go to Israel." And Danny, you got to get some idea of how simple and however simple, clear, self-assured, confident Amos Tversky was. Danny Kahneman was the opposite. And someone once said to me, Danny's superpower is doubt. That where everybody else's mind comes to rest, his refuses to. He has some great idea. He makes it even greater by doubting his own great idea. He's never settled. And where does that come from? I mean, part of it, I think, comes from his experience with war. He and his family spent 4 years living in chicken coops and barns. He watches his father die of untreated diabetes. He watches every day as a child for 4 years. He gets down on his knees and says a prayer. He says, "Dear God, I know I'm but a speck in the universe and you don't care about me, but could you please just let me live one more day?" In this period of his life, he discovers or cultivates a really peculiar imagination. And this imagination is central to their work. But none of it self-consciously, by the way. All these things I'm telling you about Danny Kahneman came out on long walks with him saying it kind of by the by, not realizing how interesting it was. And this is just generally true, that the best characters don't know their characters. And he really doesn't know what a great character is. He thinks he's normal. So think about that. And he also thinks that his childhood has nothing to do with who he is. He told me that. He says, "I'll tell you all this because you're asking the questions, but I don't think it has anything to do with who I am." But imagine this. He discovers when he's hiding in chicken coops and afraid he's going to be killed every day, this imagination that takes him out of where he is. And he imagines himself doing preposterous things like single-handedly defeating the German army. And he says it feels like it had happened. It gave me that kind of feeling like I had. And he said it was such a peculiar ability a tendency that when he gets out of France and is in Israel and is safe, he finds he shouldn't imagine having the things he wants to get, wants to achieve. He shouldn't imagine being first in his class, because the experience of imagining it is so vivid, it's as if he's got it, and he loses his motivation to go and get it. So, I mean, it's so extraordinary that he doesn't allow himself. I mean, because at the end, in 2002, when he's sitting there waiting for the Nobel Prize call, he hasn't allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to know, willfully stopped himself from imagining what it would be like to win the Nobel Prize. And I would like to come back to that at some point, because that scene is just, it's breathtaking to me, what he put himself through. But these experiences, I mean, inform their work in all kinds of ways, and their war experiences. I mean, Danny, if we go back to, my book starts with Moneyball, and the premise of Moneyball is these experts using their gut are inferior to a crude algorithm. I think the first example of Moneyball that I've encountered is Danny Kahneman, age 21, in the Israeli army, being asked to use his psychological training, which he's largely acquired by himself, because there's no psychology department at the Hebrew University, to use what he's learned in books to see if he can improve the selection of Israeli officers, because they're having problems with the officer corps. The performance on the field is poor. And Danny looks at how the Israeli army is choosing officers in 1954, and they're choosing them by basically scouts, people who think they know what an officer is, interviewing a young man for a little bit and saying, he's officer material. And Danny says, that's not going to work as well as an algorithm. And he builds the algorithm to evaluate young men that is used to this day by the Israeli army. Funny aside, I took Danny, we went for a week to Israel, and I wanted to go see his military past. And he and I went to the base where they train soldiers. And we got there, and there was a huge crowd of really pretty Israeli female soldiers waiting for us. And and I thought, Danny was in his late 70s at that point. And I thought, man, he's got it going on. And it turned out they had put on the manifest that Danny Kahneman was coming with Michael Lewis today. And there is an Israeli underwear model named Michael Lewis, who's got unbelievable abs. And to Danny's chagrin, the minute we walk through the gate, they look at us and they all just fade away. But I mean, he's noodling around as a 21-year-old in the army in response to practical demands made on him by the Israeli army, with the whole notion of what's wrong with intuitive judgment.
We should get on to behavioral economics and what you think is the crux of what they undid, if it was an undoing project, this friendship. And in fact, we were starting to get onto it there, but what do you think are the sort of the greatest insights, or the things that have affected the world when you talk about it changing the world?
So there are two ways to think about their work. One would be the way an intellectual would look at their work and say there are two bodies. They made two big contributions. One was to this field of judgment, where they uncover cognitive bias. The idea of cognitive bias, that the idea that even when the mind should be essentially doing calculating statistics, should be making a statistical estimation, that's not what the mind does. What the mind does is it tells a story, and the story is warped by various kind of kinks in the mind. It's warped by the way memory works, and it's warped by the way the mind makes similarity judgments, by the way it thinks in stereotypes. And they did all kinds of little experiments to show that you could distort people's answers to questions that had a right answer. Even professional statisticians' answers to questions that had a right answer in predictable ways. And this work has all been replicated over and over and over. This doesn't have the work of replication problems that a lot of social psychology is facing now. So for example, I mean, one of these, they end up dreaming up lots of fancy, incomprehensible jargon for what they discover. They call the rules of thumb that the mind is using when it's telling these stories, trying to judge what's going to happen in the world, or they call them heuristics. And they find several heuristics, and they put names to them. So let's take one, anchoring. The idea of anchoring is that you can distort a person's judgment by throwing a totally irrelevant piece of information right up front before they have to make the judgment. And this is a good example of just how kind of weirdly ingenious their experiments were, and how you can hear, Danny and Amos would say that when they were in a room, what they would be doing is laughing. You can kind of hear the laughter behind the experiment. But they built a wheel of fortune, and the wheel of fortune has 99 numbers on it, 1 to 99, and they invite their lab rats, students and whoever off the street, to come into a room and spin the wheel of fortune, and the wheel lands on a number. And then they ask the lab rat a question: what percentage of the countries in the United Nations come from Africa? And people who spun a high number tended to estimate a higher number of countries in the United Nations from Africa, and people who spun a low number spent a lower number. They did this over and over in all kinds of ways, showing you could do what Donald Trump does every day, right? You can distort people's judgment by throwing out stuff up front. And you could predict how that would be. So this body of work they call their work in judgment. An intellectual will then say, well, then what they did is moved on to decision making, which is a more sterile study of gambles. And it's here where they're trying to figure out why people reverse preferences, which you're not supposed to do. Why? I mean, to put it the way Richard Thaler put it to me, he said, why when you walk into the deli and you say, what do you have? What kind of sandwiches do you have? And the guy behind the counter says, we have roast beef or turkey. And you say, I'll have turkey. And then he says, oh, no, we actually have some ham in the back. And you go, then I'll have roast beef. He says, what people do people do a version of that, which is they're not supposed to do, right? It kind of screws up a lot of economic theory if the choices people make change a lot if you change the context in which they make the choices. So they do work studying the way people respond to gambles. And when they're doing this work, they stumble upon some insights that become a paper called Prospect Theory, which, believe me, you don't want to read. But it is the paper that wins them the Nobel Prize, that wins Danny the Nobel Prize in economics. But I think the most interesting insight in the paper is that if a gamble is framed as in a domain of gains, if the person who is making the gamble is thinking they're playing with gains, they are risk averse. They're less likely to take. They won't take the same bet that they would take if they think they're starting from a loss. So people have a different risk profile if they think of themselves as losing than if they think of themselves as winning. And this has lots of implications. But, you say we should be talking about economics, and, it does say that up there. I did not dream up this title. I think, so I'm going to move on to, academics would say that's what they did, and that the Prospect Theory paper, what it really did was make it academically respectable for economics to start talking about psychology and about the insights of psychology, whereas psychology had never been able to work its way into economics. These people blew a hole in the side of economics and shoved some psychology into it. And Richard Thaler comes along and reads these papers and is inside of economics and starts to deploy the psychological insights in economics, for which he's now won a Nobel Prize. I don't think of it, but I think that's a pretty reductive way to think about their collaboration. I think that they were just these two Israeli intellectuals who really almost were accidental psychologists, both of them, who were at odds with their own field, thought much of their own field was nonsense, who really are just asking what's going on inside the mind and trying to find scientifically respectable ways to investigate it. And yeah, they do generate all this stuff that ends up being internalized by economics and by psychology and other fields. But they also have all of this stuff that just ends up on the cutting room floor, which interested me as much as the stuff they were famous for. They spend an awful lot of time, a year of their lives, investigating the role of regret in decision-making, the anticipation of regret. They dream up experiments where they have a lottery, and people receive these lottery tickets. And they find that people who receive a number whose number is one away from the winning lottery ticket have more regret about the lottery than people whose number is far away. I mean, crazy stuff, right? That shouldn't happen. But the book got its title from some of their work that never found its way into print, which is Danny Kahneman got it into his head, as only Danny Kahneman would, that he wanted to study the rules of the human imagination. Now, the idea that the imagination has rules is itself an imaginative leap. And it comes to him, again it goes right back to Israel and war. His nephew, who was a navigator in a Israeli fighter jet, had been killed in an accident a day before he was due to get out of the Air Force. He'd been in for 5 years, or a day short of 5 years. And he'd been killed because a flare had gone off and blinded his pilot. And apparently when you're in a jet and you're flying that fast, you can't tell whether you're ascending or descending. And they thought they were going up, they were going down, and they flew right into the ground. So Danny goes to the funeral, and he loved this kid. But Danny, because he's Danny, doesn't grieve. Instead, what he does is watch other people grieving. And he sees what they're doing is essentially trying to imagine their way back out of the tragedy. Lots of what people are saying can be formulated as if-only statements. If only he'd gotten out of the Air Force a day earlier. If only that guy had not shot that flare. And Danny thinks, well, if you're going to engage in this game called imagination, creating alternative realities, there are a million different ways you could undo it. If only he'd been born a girl. If only there hadn't been an Israeli Air Force. If only they'd moved like they said they were going to move before he went into the Israeli Air Force. Nobody went back that far. They started at the end of the event, and they undid the first thing that had happened in time that you could undo and change the outcome. So he starts to noodle on what are the rules? Like, what are the rules of these statements? They start to put people through tests. Undo this tragedy. How do you undo this tragedy? They describe a tragedy, undo it. And they get to things. It's at that point, actually, that their relationship comes undone. Because at that point, Danny is thinking that Amos isn't paying sufficient attention to his thoughts, that Amos has become too famous, and the whole relationship is premised on a kind of uncritical acceptance by Amos of Danny's ideas, and he's not responding in the way that Danny would hope. But Amos is actually taking Danny's ideas and trying to turn it into math, trying to turn it into logic, trying to frame them in a way that you could publish in a paper. And I know this because in Amos's file cabinets was a folder that was called The Undoing Project. And when I showed it to Danny, he was ashen that Amos had spent so much time thinking about it. But this sort of work was as beguiling as the work that actually has the effects it has.
But if we talk a little bit about the broader impact, and it isn't just in economics, because it's seeing these insights about people's psychology has informed policymakers in thinking about health policy and all of these things. And it's been around for a while, as we know, because 2002 was when they won the Nobel, and then more recently now Richard Taylor's won it. But I wonder, it started off, and it's often been known as a criticism of economics and of science misunderstanding or making assumptions about human nature that were wrong. But then it seems to sort of end up sounding like a criticism of humans for being stupid. Because you're talking about, Richard Taylor talks about Homer economicus. He thinks the best model is Homer Simpson for Homer, rather than the sort of Vulcan, Dr. Spock. Do you think they actually were saying people were stupid?
No.
Because that often does seem to be the subtext. He talks about, even Tversky says, we're not into artificial intelligence, we're doing natural stupidity.
Yeah, well, Amos would occasionally say things. If Amos had some vices, and one of his vices is that he liked a cutting remark. And he was asked, does your work have any bearing on artificial intelligence? And he said, I'm much less interested in that than I am in natural stupidity. But they didn't think that way. They thought, in fact, in his more thoughtful moments, what Amos is saying is human beings are too hard on themselves because essentially some of the big things that fall out of their work are people don't decide between things, they decide between descriptions of things. And if you change the description, you change the decision, which is troubling to economists. But another thing that falls out of their work is people are always trying to make a probabilistic world deterministic. So they're taking things that are inherently unpredictable and pretending they can be predicted. As there was a throwaway line on one of his folders I saw he scribbled. He said, "Reality is not a point; it's a cloud of possibility." And they would say that, look, this business of after something happens, people coming in to explain why it happened as if it should have been predicted is nonsense. They would have looked at the election of Donald Trump. This happened instantly, right? Trump's elected, and all of a sudden there are pieces in the New York Review of Books about how this was a result of these inevitable forces in American life. And Trump, the implicit is you should have seen it coming. And their point is there's a lot you can't see coming. But our mind does this thing where we tell stories that reassure ourselves that we could have seen it coming. That we want to make the world seem more predictable than it actually is. And they were on this in a big way. They wrote a paper called On the Psychology of Prediction. And they showed the way, but mainly what they were after when they did that was they showed how you could screw up how people would predict. So their point is not that people are stupid. Their point is that fallibility is human. And when you take it into, I think the reason that people, when they think of their work, think of economics, is there's a Nobel Prize in economics. I think that if there weren't a Nobel Prize in economics, and economics didn't have the social status that it enjoys, that what people would be saying about their work is, oh my God, look what they've done in the field of medicine. That you go, in the middle of this book, there's a section with a guy who studied with both of them, a doctor named Don Rettelmeyer, who works in what is essentially Canada's largest trauma center. And it's Canada's largest trauma center because it's set up next to Canada's largest freeway. So the carnage comes off the freeway, and the doctors have to make quick diagnoses of these horrible cases, often with patients who can't communicate with them. And Don Rettelmeyer's job is to sit there and check the judgment of the doctors with essentially filtering him through what he knows about Kahneman and Tversky, the kind of mistakes they might make. This looks like, no, you can't say that that's a collapsed lung so quickly. The reason you're saying it's a collapsed lung is you just had two other people who just came in with collapsed lungs. He has saved lives, internalizing their thinking in medicine.
But in those examples, and the really powerful thing about that is the tests are themselves designed by the doctors but then when you superimpose it on their actual day-to-day behavior, it's more efficient than the doctors who created the tests.
Well, that's right. They did all kinds of funny work with Amos. You know, he was aware that one way to smuggle psychological insights into real life was through the economics discipline, and it was just because of the accident that economists were in government. There was a council of economic advisors, but there wasn't a council of psychological advisors. And he would have said there should be a council of psychological advisors. But Amos was banging on economics just because he knew that was a way to get the ideas out into the world, but he was also banging on medicine because he saw it as such a high-stakes thing. And they did one of their studies that he did with Don Rettelmeyer, the doctor, with Stanford doctors, to dramatize to physicians just how susceptible their minds were to the various illusions that Kahneman and Tversky had dug up. Was they gave them an experiment where they went to oncologists at Stanford, and they gave them this scenario. You have a patient with terminal cancer, will be dead for sure within 7 years. But there is an experimental surgery you can perform. The problem is the patient might die on the operating table, but if they survive the surgery, they're cured. With one group of subjects, they told them that there is a 90% chance the patient will survive the surgery. With the other group of subjects, doctors, they said there's a 10% chance they will die on the operating table. It's the same thing. The doctors who were told there was a 90% chance of survival were almost twice as likely to want to perform the surgery. So you wonder not only how doctors are making decisions, but you wonder if doctors who make money from the surgery are presenting to patients the statistics in a certain way so they accept the surgery. This is nudge in the medical world, and it's found its way into public policy, into other walks of life. But they were aware that the stakes were high in medicine, and they were all over medicine.
I mean, one of the criticisms of nudge, or at least when you sort of step back after over a decade of there being. We had the nudge unit in 10 Downing Street, but Cass Sunstein also worked for the Obama administration. Is it sort of, ironically, given that they were talking about the complexities of probabilities and why things might happen, it kind of seemed to give politicians an easy way out. You say, well, you know, the libertarians who don't want to force people to do things, and the others who really do want to kind of impose regulations on things, they can come together with this nice nudge.
They call it libertarian paternalism, right?
You don't have to force them, but you can have these miraculous results. And in some areas, it's really worked, and maybe in medicine, you've had some really transforming results. I can't help thinking you've also kind of let people off the hook. Maybe they should be regulated. If you really want to stop people doing something, maybe we'll stop using so much gas, for example, petrol. You know, should you just be taxing it more and not say, no, I'm going to nudge them in this way or that way? I mean, do you think there's that sort of stepping back? Maybe we've exaggerated how much it's changed the world for the better.
Well, I think we've exaggerated the complexity. It's really simple. There have been some simple manipulations that have had huge effects. And that's that. The big one is savings. The big contribution Richard Thaler has made in real life with his partner Cass Sunstein is to incorporate and government savings plans to change them from opt-in to opt-out. The mere act of asking someone to tick a box that says, no, I don't want to save 10% of my earnings, as opposed to ticking a box that says, yes, I do, causes them to save, double.
So they could just go home after that.
Yeah, well, they can go home after that. The effects have been huge. There are other places in government where they were at work looking for ways to do, school nutrition in America has been affected by them. They've changed the way the nutritional options are presented. They've changed the way, through the agriculture department, the way food's presented to kids in the cafeteria, just by moving the vegetables and the fruit to the front of the line as opposed to the back of the line. So there are lots of little things like that. All these, it's not really economics, right? It's psychology. One, you're right. It's perhaps if anybody's overstating. I don't know who's overstating the importance of all this stuff, but it's a thing that's useful, but not everything. It does change the subject to something everybody can more or less agree upon, and it does get people off the hook. I agree with that. And there may be kind of limits to how useful it is.
I think we should give people a chance to ask some questions. There's lots of other things we can talk about, but if you put your hand up and then wait for the microphone. I remember for this place, it's very hard to see. All right. From here, I'll take a few. We got numbers, that's right. You'll get a number right over there. Okay, so take number 1 first.
Michael, your books have been very influential, and that's given you a certain power. Do you feel you might choose a future book to try and do something more useful for society, be targeted on attacking corporate tax avoidance or some other social good rather than the more intellectual things you've done?
When are you going to stop slacking, I think, is the other thing.
So
start changing the world, really. So the second one.
So it's funny you say this, because I think the minute I try to be worthy, I cease to be useful.
I wish other people had that feeling. Number 2 is over there, yes.
Yes. Having lived through and documented each boom and bust since '87, and now worked with behavioral economics, do you think the cycles are inevitable?
You know, it's not because of behavioral economics that I think the cycles are inevitable. And behavioral economics has a bit to say about this, but not all that much. It's just the cycles seem inevitable because it's been ever thus. Do I think people will altogether do stupid things and we'll all pay prices for them in the financial markets over and over and over again? Yes, I do.
Although what was funny about 1987, which I think sort of made people forget you could have a real financial crisis that really affected the real economy, was that you had that crash and you didn't have a recession and people paid the price in the markets, but there wasn't a broader effect. We didn't go through the kind of thing we went through with the global financial crisis. So I think I would also, there's a sort of difference in those.
The crises aren't all the same. And you can even make the case that the '87 stock market crash was sort of robot-induced because it was portfolio issues. It was people following. It was rule-based investing that drove the market down. It was different from. Very different in flavor from 2007.
And the market went right back up again within the year.
Curious to know if you've used any of the principles of behavioral economics or psychology in the marketing of your books. So I'm thinking the photos on the cover, the color, the caption, the titles, if there's A/B testing of, this will inspire purchases. So using them for commercial means.
Well, Penguin is here. My publisher, we could ask them. I tell you more generally is that it's very hard when you're exposed to these guys for as long as I was exposed to them, not to have them start to infect your life. I didn't really think much about how they could help me sell my books. But I don't think that much about how to sell the books. So that's part of the problem. The publisher does it. I don't do it. I do what they tell me to do. And it's still that whole process of how a book sells is still a little mysterious to me. But there were other effects that I've really internalized. And can I give one? This is yet another example of how so much of what they did is not contained by a vessel called medicine or economics or judgment or decision making. So Kahneman Danny and Amos both had lots of different roles in the Israeli military. And one of Kahneman's roles was to train Air Force fighter pilot instructors, not the pilots. He knew nothing about flying. He was teaching people how to teach. And in the course of training these instructors, he got this feedback from them saying, basically that when you're teaching fighter pilots how to fly, criticism works and praise does not. And he said, why do you think that? And the instructor said, well, when we criticize them, he says, when a pilot has done something spectacular and we've praised them, we've noticed that the next thing he does is less spectacular. And when he does something really bad and we get on him, we notice that he improves. And we've taken away from this that they're kind of, they get full of themselves if you praise them, but they respond to the toughness, they respond to pain, not pleasure. And Kahneman said, well, that's not what's going on. That's a statistical illusion. That's reversion to the mean. Anytime you do something especially spectacular, the next thing you're going to do is a little less spectacular. And anytime you do something that's especially awful, all left to your own devices, the next thing you're going to do is going to be a little bit better. And so this isn't about your words. This is a statistical phenomenon. But being Kahneman, he doesn't just stop there. He says, the world is telling everybody who teaches people, that parents, teachers, coaches, that the pain works and the pleasure doesn't. Because of this feedback, this illusion that the criticism leads to improvement after a bad thing happens, and the praise leads to lesser performance. So. When I heard him describe this to me, by the way, this was in his manuscript that he'd chucked out into the garbage can. I thought, in my own, we're subjected to this constant enforcement of this message. And so when I parent or coach now, I now take the view that the criticism should be very sparing and the praise should be effusive. For no other reason than quite possibly my words are going to have no effect at all. And if I'm going to inflict either pleasure or pain, I might as well just inflict the pleasure. But there are little things like that, or the Undoing Project. Yeah, I watch sports, and I have favorite teams. And I get upset when they lose. And I spin a narrative in my head after they lose about why they lost. And I noticed that I blame the guy who screwed up at the end of the game. God help the field goal kicker who missed the extra point.
If only.
Yes, if God help the penalty kicker who missed the penalty kick. When in fact, if you go back over the game, there's quite likely something that happened in the beginning of the game that no one got credit or proper blame for, that you could more plausibly blame the defeat on. So when I watch sports, I think differently about how I'm assigning credit and blame for whatever just happened. Let me just think, anybody who watches sports, one interesting exercise to sort of seek to get Danny and Amos's point about how the people want the world to seem more deterministic than it is listen to the announcers. As the game shifts, they're always telling a story that sort of suggests they have explained why what's just happened is happening. So if your team is winning, they have a narrative going about why this team is so good, how well coached it is. Oh, it's amazing what teammates they are. It's amazing the chemistry on this team. Then all of a sudden they're losing. Oh shit, the narrative changes. Did you hear there were drugs in their locker room? Did you hear it changes instantly. We do this in life. We do this in life constantly. So they heighten your awareness as you move through the world without being entirely useful. Without being able, one of the maddening things about their work is they themselves would say, what they're saying, their message, their deep message is, this isn't window dressing on our minds. This is who we are. And we can't change who we are. That you're going to make these mistakes even if you know about them. As easily as even after an optical illusion is pointed out to you, you still see the optical illusion. That your mind will still deceive you even if you know about this, and there's a limited use value. They are not a how-to book. That wasn't what they were really on about. But still, as you move through the world and you know their work, it enriches your life.
I think back here.
Was it easier to write about Amos acutely because he was gone, or harder to write about Danny because he was still present?
Was I worried that Danny was going to be mad at me? And yes, I was. And I couldn't do anything about it. Although I had Amos's widow on my shoulder, so there was that was a little, but they were, at the end of their relationship, they were like two lovers who had a horrible falling out. And if you've ever had friends who've gotten divorced and you love them both and you sit down with them independently, it's amazing how they can get you to hate the other one. You're right? It's amazing how the two stories just don't sync up. The short story was Danny was emotionally needy and neurotic, and Amos thought it was undignified to service those qualities. There's a line in a letter. They're these love letters, these breakup letters. And there's a line in a letter from Amos to Danny that I think just captures the spirit of the problem in the relationship. He says at one point, the line is, "I don't get your sensitivity metric." Now, anybody who can write that will never get anybody's sensitivity metric, right? And because I was writing in the end about a dispute to which there were two sides, I was aware that both sides had the potential to be pissed off at me by how I described it. And I thought in my mind what I should be doing is writing this thing in such a way that the kind of people who could write the phrase, "I don't get your sensitivity metric," would take Amos's side of things. And the kind of people who would wonder how could anybody write such a thing would take Danny's side of things. And the result is I didn't please anybody. So I had everybody a little upset with me in the beginning. But I don't think I felt an obligation to Amos because he was dead to be especially fair, to do my best to see his point of view, because he wasn't there to express it, and Danny was. And I assumed that Danny was yanking me all over the place in my mind to see this thing in a certain way. What does it say?
Good evening. So, very much enjoyed the book. One of the impressions I got was that you could enjoy it if you saw it as a sort of academic tribute act to P.T. Barnum. Many of the ideas held therein.
I didn't get this.
Oh, so
I didn't hear that.
I felt that a lot of the ideas of Mr. Kahneman and Mr. Tversky
Right.
were already held within P.T. Barnum.
Oh.
It's like a showman event
Well, that's funny you said that.
of analysis. This is my own personal impression.
Well, Amos did say at one point to his son, "Nothing we've done isn't known to a really good used car salesman." And there is some truth to that. That what they did is articulate what's going on when people are being manipulated, not so much discovering that they're being manipulated in the first place. So I'd agree with that. There's some truth to that.
over here. Actually, could you, and I've forgotten some of my instructions, could you stand up when you ask a question so we can catch you?
Yes, hello. I was interested in what you were saying about the predictability of events. Obviously, in The Big Short, you focus on people who managed to predict the crisis of 2007 and 2008. And when I'm reading it, I think these guys are just a bunch of oddballs. You know, they're not the people I would naturally think are going to be perceptive about future events. Do you have an insight how to sort out the oddballs from the naturally perceptive?
So it's a really interesting question because you've discovered the weakness in The Big Short. And the weakness is that, which I just hope people wouldn't notice. But I'll tell you what it is because you forced my hand. Those people who got it right, I knew I could seduce the reader into following them because they got it right. Because nobody wants to be with a stupid person. People want to be with a smart person. And they did, in fact, diagnose what had happened very well and could teach the reader what had gone on inside the financial system. But the idea that they were geniuses because they made all this money, there's some truth to it, But the greater truth is there was a huge amount of luck in that. That they could easily have been right about what was going on in the financial system and wrong on their bets. And they got lucky. They all got lucky with the timing. I used the reader's willingness to suspend disbelief in the presence of people who had made huge sums of money betting against Wall Street banks to teach the reader about what had happened. I don't think that those people who were at the center of The Big Short have any crystal ball, that they aren't, they've subsequently proved themselves unable to predict anything else. I mean, none of them have had a second act, right? I love them all. They're all really smart. They were all really, kind of principled in seeing what was going on. And they were all really brave to make the bets they did. But they were also all really lucky.
Over here.
Hi, I was wondering to what extent you can draw a line between behavioral economics and psychology.
That's a great question, because the psychologists are furious it's called behavioral economics. They feel like their work has been stolen by economics. All this great stuff has been stolen and just relabeled economics, and the economists are getting credit for it again. So I suppose Thaler himself would say you can't. So how can I? I mean, I could try, but the point of behavioral economics is to let psychology into economics.
Which I think even Thaler said himself, or quoted others saying, that it should be redundant to say behavioral economics, because that's what economics should have been about in the first place, about the behavior of people. But it shows how stupid economists were, that it took, they needed an extra adjective to add to it. Whereas I'm not sure that the trouble is
Yeah, Michael, you talked about the fact they understood human fallibility, and I wonder whether out of that there was a suspicion that they actually thought the art of economics and the attendant predictions was worthless.
Amos had great respect for economists. He liked the rigor of economics. He liked the math of economics, and it was really Danny who dragged him to the idea of systematic error. He wouldn't have gotten there without Danny. So they didn't think economists were stupid, and in fact, the reverse. Amos thought the best of the economists, Ken Arrow, for example, Thomas Schelling, with whom he was friends, he much preferred their company to the company of his fellow psychologists. But he did think there were problems with their field, which is different. And he put this very nicely to an economist he didn't particularly like, but a prominent Harvard economist. Amos was with him at a conference, and they were out having a drink or dinner. And the guy was going on and on about how his students were all stupid, and these people in the markets he was watching were all stupid. And Amos turned to him and said, "You think everyone's stupid, but all your models assume they're smart and rational. How do you figure that one out?" And so he was aware there was a problem in the field, which he distinguished from a problem with the economists.
Okay, the upside down three at the back.
You know,
you don't have to
the
deliver a
equivalent
question
of
upside
affirmative
down.
action here is going to the back.
Yeah, I know,
right.
I know.
Thank you very much for the talk. You've spoken a lot about human fallibility and how being fallible makes you stupid, and how being smart is being rational. I'd just be interested to know if you think there are scenarios in which actually being fallible produces, say, the second best outcome, falling short of always being perfectly rational.
Well, I don't think I've said that being smart is being rational. That I'm very sympathetic to these errors and the people who make them. Less sympathetic to people who don't acknowledge their fallibility. So I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
I think it was a version, when we were talking earlier about did they really think people were stupid, but I think it's that sense people feel uneasy that that it's all about how humans are stupid, when you could say the model of rationality is stupid because it never bore any relation to the way people think.
And there is this great question, what are we going to do about it? And so the model of the doctor who's sitting there checking the thinking of other doctors was what they had in mind with when you asked them what we might do about it. It's funny, these guys, they briefly thought, they quickly decided after trying to consult with Israeli military leaders and government leaders and they realized that you were never going to change the minds of grown-ups. You were never going to teach them how to think statistically as opposed to intuitively when you should think statistically. They then designed a curriculum for Israeli school children because they thought maybe if you get to them when they're 10, and then they abandoned that. They decided that's not going to work. And where they ended up on like what you do with this fact that we are fallible, we're wired for certain kinds of fallibility, was, I think, encapsulated in a little, there's a little moment in the book where Amos is, basically everybody by the early 80s, anybody who had a problem with decision making or judgment came to Amos Tversky. He was famous in the field and a lot more famous than Danny. And there was a man who ran the pilot training program for Delta Airlines, the big US airline. And there was a period in the late 70s and early 80s where, oddly, Delta Airlines was having problems with the judgments of its pilots. There were several weird things that happened, judgmental errors that alarmed the management of Delta Airlines. I mean, the most curious one, pilots were landing in the wrong airports, which you think, how does that happen, right? I mean, really, how does it happen? And I talked to this man who ran the training program, who had called up Amos and said, what do we do? What's going on here? And Amos went and gave them a brief short course on Kahneman Tversky, and then asked the guy, and said to them, you're not going to, the pilot who lands in the wrong airport, people are going to make mistakes. But what does the cockpit look like? I mean, what do people do in the cockpit? He says, and the guy explained that at the time, the pilot was an autocrat, that the co-pilots were not encouraged, the junior pilots, encouraged to question the captain. And Amos said, that's the best you can do is change that. Change the culture of decision-making so that the person who is making the decision has other voices in his ear, because while you can't see your own mistakes, while you can't see you've been fooled by this optical illusion, sometimes other people can. And this guy who was in charge of training 8,000 Delta Airlines pilots said, Amos Tversky in that one session changed the structure, the culture of the American commercial airline cockpit. We changed it Delta, and then everybody else followed because we saw the wisdom of that. And that's kind of so you never get away from the fallibility, but you know, the best you can do is sort of try to adjust your environment for it. You know who did this is Obama. Obama saw himself saw the job of president as essentially a decision-making job, and he tried to structure his environment to prevent him making the kinds of mistakes that Kahneman Tversky would predict he would make. Trump is not.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about that in a minute, but number 4 at the back.
Okay.
Why do they have numbers?
So that I can see them.
Oh.
I just wondered if they had any interaction with Dan Ariely, the other Israeli behavioral economist, or what they thought of him, or what you think of him, if he's as brilliant.
So I don't know Dan Ariely, so I don't have anything to say. I think that Danny Kahneman and Ariely have written a couple of papers together. There are a whole wave of young or now middle-aged Israeli academics who are their disciples, but I don't think Ariely is one of them.
So you mentioned earlier that there's a hospital that employs someone to check doctors' biases, but then you also mentioned that the biggest bias of all is that we can identify others' biases but not our own. So no matter how much we learn, we can't correct our biases. So are we condemned to this perpetual cycle where we need someone to check our own biases? And does that inherently make the person who checks the doctor's biases useful? Do we need someone to check his biases?
Yes and yes. Excellent question.
All right, we're going to have one more question which I think, okay, but did you ask a question at the beginning? No, okay, sorry. Just checking.
You talked about how the collaboration kind of went sour at the end, and obviously history's littered with lots of collaborations which lasted a very long time and kind of ran their natural course. Was there any sense from the work you did that there was rivalry and jealousy between them that was actually at the core?
So what caused the collaboration to collapse?
You talked about that, but I just wonder whether behind that there's actually kind of some rivalry, jealousy that actually triggers it.
You know, it was interesting because I only had one side alive to tell me, but there was Amos left his own versions in his files. But what seemed to have driven the collaboration, I think which drives a lot of collaborations, is the uncritical acceptance of each other's ideas. And as Danny said once, he said, when we said something, the other didn't ask, is that true? They asked, what might it be true of? It was the relationship was an improv comedy relationship, the structure of it. That if I say something to you, you don't reject it, you accept it, and you build on it. However idiotic it may seem at first. And they did this with each other, and it just went places. What happens is, because Amos gets very, very famous, he gets the MacArthur Genius Award without Danny, he gets the quickest tenured appointment at Stanford in the history of the university. When Danny can't get a job at a university, there was a very unequal division of spoils that caused some jealousy, but it wasn't the jealousy that was the problem, and I believe Danny on this subject. The problem was Danny began to sense that Amos thought he started to believe the feedback he was getting from the world, and he sensed more criticism from Amos as a result. So instead of accepting whatever Danny said and building on it, Danny felt like a bit of a rejection. So this gets us to the Nobel Prize, because when Amos Tversky dies in 1996, there are a lot of people who have told you that he would have gotten the Nobel Prize in economics alone. But they don't give the Nobel Prize in economics to people who aren't alive. And now that he's not around, when people look at the work, the person who's alive is Danny. So Danny, having been neglected for quite a long time during the relationship, everybody sees the genius in Amos. They can't understand. Danny's genius is harder to see. In 2001, he's invited by Stockholm to come and give a talk, which is an audition for the Nobel Prize. They know the work is so important, it deserves it. They kind of have heard rumors that Danny wasn't as important as Amos, because that's been in the air for the entire relationship. He goes and gives a talk and comes back. And this is where I wanted to get to this story, because I found it was so him, and also spoke so much to the relationship and what made it tick and why it didn't tick when it stopped ticking. Danny was given to believe this was in 2000. If he was going to get the prize at all, he was going to get it in 2002. And at any given moment, when the economics prize is about to be given out, you're not going to believe this. There are 100 people sitting by phones thinking they're going to get the Nobel Prize in economics, or might. So they're up at 4 in the morning in the United States waiting for the call from Stockholm. And as Amos said, there shouldn't be any of these prizes. For every one person who gets it, 99 people are made miserable. But Danny was sitting by the phone with his wife, and the call doesn't come. And as I said, he hadn't allowed himself to imagine up to that point what it would be like to get the Nobel Prize. So the call doesn't come. His wife says kind of sadly, oh well, and leaves the room. And he then allows himself to imagine how it would go if he won the Nobel Prize. And what he imagines is doing all the things for Amos that Amos, who didn't get his sensitivity metric, wouldn't do for him. He would bring Amos's wife, widow, and children to the ceremony. He would write a biography of Amos and weave it into his acceptance speech. He would take a big photograph of Amos and put it up over his head as he spoke and received the Nobel Prize. He was going to physically insist on Amos getting joint credit for the work in a way that Amos never insisted that Danny get joint credit for the work. It was what ate at him. And then the phone rings. And he gets the prize. And he does all of it.
Well, It's exactly 8:30, which is when we promise people we can leave. I mean, one of the interesting, great lines in the book, which I was thinking of when you were talking about the pilots, is I think, and you would remind me which one says it, but it says it can be much easier to change the world than to prove you've changed the world. And I think that is true, and we've had a sense of it from you. That is true of so many of their ideas, even though you can't always put your finger on it, and there may not be easy policy solutions, but they do come to life in this book, and it is on sale in the foyer. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.